On May 31st, 1889, engineers at a private fishing club in western Pennsylvania watched a dam begin to fail. They had been watching it fail slowly for a decade. They sent a warning to the city of Johnstown, 14 miles downstream, at noon. The warning never arrived. At 3:10 in the afternoon, the South Fork Dam collapsed. 20 million tons of water moved down the Kennesaw Valley at 40 miles per hour. A 40-foot wall carrying houses, locomotives, barbed wire, and human beings hit the city of Johnstown 65 minutes later. 2,209 people died. It was the greatest single-day loss of civilian life in the United States between the Civil War and September 11, 2001. Investigators found clear evidence that the dam had been negligently rebuilt, that its owners had ignored engineers' warnings for years, that a discharge pipe that might have controlled the water level had been removed to lower costs, that a fish screen installed across the spillway had blocked drainage and contributed to the overtopping. The men who owned the dam were among the wealthiest in America: Carnegie, Frick, Mellon, the founders of the American steel industry. Not one of them paid a single dollar in damages. Not one of them was ever held legally responsible. And the people of Johnstown buried their dead. Johnstown, Pennsylvania in 1889 was exactly what its geography suggested. A working city in a narrow valley at the confluence of three rivers, 30,000 people, steel mills and iron works that produced railroad ties and barbed wire and the materials that were building the American economy. Workers from Germany, Hungary, Wales, Sweden, and a dozen other countries who had come for steady wages and stayed. The city sat on a floodplain. Everyone knew it. The rivers flooded regularly. People put their valuables on upper shelves in May and went about their lives. No flood had ever threatened the city seriously enough to change that calculation. 14 miles upstream, 450 feet higher in elevation, sat Lake Kennesaw. The lake was man-made, created by the South Fork Dam, which had been built in the 1840s as part of a state canal system and later abandoned when railroads made the canals obsolete. For years it sat unmaintained, its condition deteriorating. In 1879, a group of Pittsburgh businessmen purchased the property and formed the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club. The members list read like a directory of Gilded Age power: Andrew Carnegie, Henry Clay Frick, Andrew Mellon, 47 members in total, representing the concentrated wealth of America's industrial moment. They rebuilt the dam, restocked the lake, built a clubhouse, and spent summers in the hills of western Pennsylvania fishing and boating and entertaining each other away from the grime and heat of Pittsburgh. The club was not open to the public. It was not open to inspection. When engineers in Johnstown sent letters warning about the condition of the dam, the club did not respond. When a mill owner named Daniel Morrill hired an engineer named John Fulton to inspect the dam, Fulton submitted a detailed report. The discharge pipes had been removed during reconstruction. Without them, there was no mechanism to lower the lake's water level in an emergency. The iron screens installed across the spillway to prevent fish from escaping could clog with debris in a storm. The dam had not been restored to its original height. A breach was possible under certain rainfall conditions. Morrill sent the report to the club. The club acknowledged the letter. Nothing was changed. That report was written in 1880. The dam held for 9 more years. The spring of 1889 had been wet across western Pennsylvania. By the end of May, the rivers were already running above normal, and the ground was saturated. Then, on the night of May 30th, a low-pressure system that had been moving east from Nebraska for 2 days arrived over the region. What followed was the heaviest recorded rainfall event in that part of Pennsylvania up to that point. The United States Army Signal Corps estimated that between 6 and 10 inches of rain fell in a single 24-hour period. Rivers that were already running high rose faster. Small creeks became roaring currents that tore out telegraph lines and washed away rail lines. At the South Fork Dam, the lake was filling faster than anything its operators had seen. By the morning of May 31st, Lake Kennesaw was within 2 feet of the top of the dam. The club's president, Elias Unger, organized crews to work on the spillway and the dam's crest. They attempted to cut a new overflow channel. They added sandbags to raise the dam's height. Nothing worked. The fish screens blocking the spillway were doing exactly what John Fulton had warned they would do 9 years earlier. They were clogged with debris. Water that should have been draining was backing up instead. At noon, a warning was telegraphed to the village of South Fork, a few miles down the valley. The message was supposed to reach Johnstown, 14 miles further downstream. The telegraph lines were already down. The message never arrived. At 3:10 in the afternoon, the center of the South Fork Dam gave way. The noise was described by survivors as 100 trains crashing together simultaneously. The lake emptied in approximately 40 minutes. 20 million tons of water poured down the Little Kennesaw Valley. The flood front picked up everything in its path: trees stripped from the hillsides, locomotives from the rail yards, houses lifted entirely from their foundations, barbed wire from the Cambria Iron Works, livestock, people. The water moved at 40 miles per hour through the narrow valley. It was carrying so much mass and momentum that when it struck buildings, the impact was not a flood. It was a collision. The towns of East Kennesaw and Woodville were hit first. Trains in the rail yard were swept away. Engine number 11 survived, and its engineer, John Hess, opened the throttle and ran his locomotive ahead of the flood for a mile, blowing the whistle continuously to warn residents. He saved an unknown number of lives before the flood overtook him. In Johnstown itself, most residents had prepared for a typical spring flood. People had moved belongings upstairs. Some had already left for higher ground. None of them had prepared for what arrived at 4:10 in the afternoon. The flood front entered the city at approximately 40 feet high. In the time it took the wave to cross Johnstown, entire neighborhoods ceased to exist. A family could be on the second floor of their house and be gone in seconds. Survivors described the sound as the end of the world. Others described it as strangely silent. Because the mass of water and debris moved so fast that there was no warning sound before it arrived. The wave was simply there. The flood wave reached the stone bridge at the bottom of Johnstown and stopped. Not because the water stopped, because the debris stopped. The stone bridge acted like a massive sieve. The houses, the locomotives, the trees, the barbed wire, the animals, the bodies, all of it compressed against the bridge's stone arches and formed a pile 30 acres wide. People who had survived the initial flood wave were trapped on top of this debris field as the water rose around them. At around 6 in the evening, the debris pile caught fire. No one knows with certainty what ignited it. The most probable cause was coals spilling from a flooded kitchen or oil from a ruptured railroad tank car contacting a heat source. What happened next was the element of the Johnstown disaster that made it almost incomprehensible to people who read about it in newspapers across the country. People who had survived a 40-foot wall of water were now burning to death on top of the wreckage. The fire burned for 3 days. 80 people died in the Stone Bridge fire alone. By the time the flood was over and the fire had exhausted itself, the final count was 2,209 dead. 900 of those bodies were never found. 777 were found but never identified. 99 entire families had been completely wiped out. 396 children were dead. Clara Barton arrived in Johnstown on June 5th, 5 days after the flood. She was 67 years old and had founded the American Red Cross 8 years earlier. The Johnstown flood was the organization's first major disaster relief operation. She stayed for 5 months. Her organization set up distribution stations, organized food and supply deliveries, and coordinated the work of the roughly 7,000 relief workers who eventually arrived in Johnstown from across the country and from 18 foreign nations. In the meantime, the press had turned its full attention to the dam. Reporters from New York and Chicago arrived within days. John Fulton's 1880 report, the one warning about the discharge pipes and the fish screens and the insufficient repairs, was published in the newspapers. The members of the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club were named. Carnegie, Frick, Mellon, the men whose names were on the Pittsburgh mills that employed many of the dead workers of Johnstown. Public outrage was immediate and sustained. Editorial cartoons in national magazines showed the club members fishing in a lake while Johnstown drowned below. One Johnstown newspaper wrote simply, "Our misery is the work of man." The survivors filed lawsuits. Pennsylvania had no meaningful dam safety regulations. Courts ruled repeatedly that the club members could not be held liable because the flood had been caused by an act of nature, a severe rainstorm, not solely by the dam's condition. The legal framework of the era made it essentially impossible to hold private property owners responsible for the downstream consequences of their negligence when a natural event had contributed to the outcome. Not a dollar was ever paid to a flood victim or victim's family by the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club or any of its individual members. Carnegie donated money to the relief effort. He funded the construction of a library in Johnstown. He did not acknowledge liability. The club disbanded. The property was auctioned in 1891. The members returned to Pittsburgh and continued their lives. The Johnstown flood did not immediately produce federal dam safety legislation. That would take decades. What it did produce was the beginning of a legal and professional conversation that had not existed before. Within weeks of the disaster, the American Society of Civil Engineers appointed a committee to investigate the dam failure. The report, when it finally appeared, was widely criticized as deliberately incomplete. The club's engineers had been given access to shape its conclusions. Clear evidence of the dam's deficiencies was minimized. The engineering profession's willingness to compromise its findings to protect wealthy clients created a scandal within professional circles that eventually drove the ASCE to adopt its first formal code of ethics. Pennsylvania began the process, slow and contested, of establishing state inspection and licensing requirements for dams. Most states eventually followed. It took decades. The legal concept of liability for dangerous conditions on private property gradually expanded through court decisions in the decades after Johnstown. influenced in part by the public anger at the club's legal immunity. The American Red Cross emerged from the disaster with the organizational credibility it needed to secure congressional recognition as an official relief organization. Historians later noted that the Johnstown flood was a defining moment in American understanding of the relationship between industrial wealth and public safety. It was one of the first events in which the American public saw clearly that private profit could create public risk, and that the law as then written offered no remedy. The men who owned the dam understood this. They did nothing to prevent the flood that the warning signs told them was coming. They did nothing to accept responsibility when it arrived, and the law agreed with them. The city of Johnstown rebuilt. It was flooded again in 1936 and again in 1977. The valley that made it vulnerable was the same valley that made it valuable. There was nowhere else to put a steel town in the mountains of western Pennsylvania. The South Fork Dam site is now a national memorial managed by the National Park Service. You can stand on the remnants of the earthen dam and look down the valley toward where the lake used to be. The club members' cottages are gone. The clubhouse is gone. The fish that the screens were meant to protect are gone. What remains is a gap in the hillside where the water broke through, and markers knotting where the water was, and how fast it moved, and how many people died when it arrived. The men who built the dam built it badly and then refused to fix it. The men who warned them about it wrote letters that were ignored. The water did exactly what John Fulton's 1880 report said it would do under the right conditions. 2,209 people paid for a decade of negligence with their lives. Not a nickel was ever collected from the men responsible. It was, the newspapers said at the time, the work of man. And so was the silence that followed. Did you know about the Johnstown flood before today? Tell me in the comments what part of this story stayed with you.